I have two announcements before we get going with the Kahoot. So I posted these, but we have a liftoff survey, and that must be completed if you want to be in liftoff. The qualitative parts of it, so the second part of it is optional. You just have to read through one quick initial page of the liftoff expectations and agree to that. And then there will be a second page. And what you do in that second page is you can list your project idea, and you can also put down individuals who you would like to work with. This does not guarantee that you're going to be paired with those individuals, but it is something we will take into consideration when we're making these groups. And also, when putting your project ideas or when talking about your project ideas, what I want everyone to think very hard about is you don't know who you're going to be matched with, and you don't know what project idea you're going to be working on. So if you feel very passionate about your project idea, start thinking about how you're going to pitch that to a group of people that you're not necessarily super familiar with. Not only is that going to help you raise the chances of working on that project with your group, but it will also help you down the line when you are talking to an employer in an interview. So I definitely want everybody to start thinking about that if you have a project idea that you feel passionate about working on. Additionally, we will be having an event on the 7th, a technical portion completion event at Launch Code. So on Delmar Boulevard, 4811. I don't know the zip code, but it's that address. And we are going to be just having a nice get together. I'm still working out the logistics of what that will look like, but we will also be able to have people call in. So it won't just be for in person. We will have an opportunity to have an open mic and maybe talk about liftoff questions or transitioning into liftoff and reflecting on Unit 1 and Unit 2. And it'll just be a nice chance to get together and chat with other people from the cohort. And those are all the announcements I have. Matthew Creek, do you have a question before I pass it over to Carrie?
Is it just like a get together thing, or is this like a graduation?
It is not a graduation because we will be having an official graduation for the entire unit completion after liftoff is over. So after Unit 3 is over. So this is not the official graduation ceremony, but we had something down on 4/7, and I figured, hey, this is a good opportunity to celebrate the achievement of completing the technical portion of Launch Code, and also saying goodbye to your TAs, saying goodbye to CEM. Carrie will not be with you, likewise, unfortunately. So we'll be passed out over to Magdalene and starting the project portion. And that is all I have. So Carrie, take it away.
All right. Well, we've got 18 people in the Kahoot so far. Let me get this up on the screen. The link is in the announcements channel if you want to go that route. I'll give everybody a minute to get in here. And then we'll start the quiz. It's a short one, just kind of covering the most obvious concepts from ORM Part 3. And then once we're done with this, we'll get into authentication. Okay, we seem to have stalled at 39. Oh, still got more people coming in. That's all right. You can jump in like right now. You'll still be able to answer questions. Okay, let's get started. ORM Part 3 review. Let's see. All right, quiz. Which annotation should be applied to the styles field in the artwork class below according to the diagram? They apparently gave a lot of time for this one. Okay. Yes, many to many. So each of these has a list of all of the ones that are connected to it. So there's multiple styles for each artwork and multiple artworks for each style. So this is a many to many relationship. Good. Good stage. Oh, you guys are funny. Which annotation should be applied to the details field in the artwork class below according to the diagram? Good. Yeah, it's a one-to-one relationship. And it's a little interesting. You'll notice I didn't really connect it to any particular field because we don't actually put an artwork field in the artwork details class. And so I just kind of indicated it that way. But we do have exactly one artwork details object that's part of artwork. Okay. Horse in the lead. What does the parameter cascade in the code below do? Good. Yeah. So there's really, there are three separate concepts, and each one of the lines of code here is doing one of these things. So the first one, that cascade parameter, is making it so that when you save the details object through the artwork repository, it makes sure to include the details object as well. And so it's actually going to put new information in both of those tables in the database. The second one is the @valid. That's what enables the detail objects properties to be validated along with artworks properties. And the third line is just, how you create an artwork details class, object details. And that's just regular Java. That has nothing to do with persistence or validation. Okay, so good. Let's go to the next one. What is the logical order inside the post handler to save an artwork object when the user selects one or more styles? Okay. So about half of you got it. So yeah, the first thing that we do in any handler, if we're doing validation, is check for errors. You're going to see that again tonight when we're working on the handlers for the login and registration pages. You always check for errors first. And then, you know, if you have errors, you can just send them back to the form and no more logic is needed. So in this case, we're doing that first. And then we are going to go get all of the objects from the database for styles using that find all by IDs method we learned. That's a CRUD repository method. It's built in. And it will return all the style objects. And so then we can use the setter in the artwork class to set that into the styles field of the artwork object. And of course, that instance of artwork was provided through model binding as a parameter. And so then all we have to do once we have the styles set into it, along with all of the other information that came from the form for the other fields, then we just save it to the repository, the artwork repository to the database. And since we use Cascade, it all just cascades down. Actually, yeah, well, with styles, yeah. So, okay, good. Let's, 5 of 6. Okay, multi-select. Which of the following are true about the artwork styles table? Okay, all right, so let's talk this through. Artwork styles is a join table. So, you know, this one, and the idea is because it joins together the artwork and style tables when there is a many-to-many relationship. So it's a special table. It's not created by any kind of class or entity. It's created as a result of two different entities having a many-to-many relationship with each other. And so, you know, the one-to-many and many-to-one will not create a join table typically. And it only has the two columns. It just has the artwork ID and the styles ID, just so you can relate, you know, one to the other. It doesn't really need an ID of its own for each of those entries. You just have to know what the relationship is between the two. Okay. Last question. The CRUD repository method find all by ID returns an iterable collection of objects which must be cast to list of styles. Yeah, that's true. If you remember from the way we were coding that out, we were using that casting because it does not return it as a list, but we need it to be in a list because that's actually what the object is typed as in the class. Good. All right, let's see how you guys did. 3rd place, Jamie. Good job, Jamie. 2nd place, Matt W. And 1st place, on stage, whoever you are. Runners up, Maple and Adam. Okay, great job, guys. Okay. We are going to talk about authentication tonight. This is a kind of a big topic, and hang on, it was not fully plugged in, and I was about to lose my laptop. Okay, so yeah, we're going to talk about authentication. Big topic. We're going to take actually, believe it or not, what is the simplest approach because we only have one class to talk about it. But yeah, there is a lot to talk about. I'm going to mostly do it through coding, kind of like, the last couple of lectures. So I've got some words on the slides, but we're going to probably spend most of our time in the code. The announcements that Colin gave are on the slide. I will, go past it. We'll do the lecture. You guys will do your studio. Tonight's studio is Tech Jobs Authentication Edition. So it's like a really pared down version of Tech Jobs, persistent Tech Jobs, that you'll practice doing this authentication process with. So yeah, announcements. Got the great assignment deadline on here again. There's the liftoff survey that Colin mentioned. Please fill that out as soon as possible. And then the celebration on the 7th of April, Colin's going to post something for you to RSVP. Okay, so we're talking about verifying a user's identity. We'll kind of talk about the concept of authentication, talk about what sessions and cookies are, how the whole flow works with authentication, talk about password hashing, what that is. Then the user model and repository, kind of how we start setting that up. DTOs, and I did promise you that because I didn't cover it in last week, I would kind of explain that a little bit. So I'm going to do that. And then we'll use those DTOs as part of the registration and login setup. We'll get the template set up, get the controller handlers set up. And then the last thing is filtering requests, because it's one thing to set up all of your authentication, but it's another thing to actually make it possible for you to say which pages a user can see versus what the entire public of the World Wide Web can see, whether they're logged in or not. Okay, so we're going to kind of just go through all of this. Let's talk about authentication as a concept. This is verifying a user's identity. So if you only want certain areas of your website to be available to a registered user, you're going to need to have authentication in place so that you can verify that they have, in most cases, a username password combo. And then that gives you the ability to kind of filter what they see. So we've got, this same diagram that you've seen before that kind of shows the MVC, model here with the database and the user kind of interacting with the view in the browser. And so the idea is that there's kind of this invisible filter that you're placing and saying, okay, you're requesting to be able to view something here, but we need to do a little bit of work here between the browser and the controller to, or between the application, I should say, to decide whether or not you can see that. And then, of course, the login process is part of that. So that's kind of what we're talking about. And you've probably heard the terms authentication and authorization. And so people will throw around auth, and it's kind of like, okay, which auth are you talking about? But the concepts seem similar, but they're, they are distinct. So authentication just asks, do we even know you? Like, who are you? Do we know you? Do we have any record of you? And then authorization says, okay, we know you, but what kind of permissions do you have to interact with our site as a known user? So it's kind of the second thing that you do after you authenticate someone is then, check their authorization. So these things are usually done in a bundle so that you can kind of have different types of users that you give different levels of access or control. But just authentication is only going to basically say you're either a logged in user or you're not. So that's what we're going to be doing tonight. So Spring does have this big package called Spring Security. That's super cool. It does amazing things. It actually makes all of the basic stuff that we're doing tonight very simple, just does it magically. But the implementation of the entire thing is actually quite labor intensive. And so it's not something we can do in one night. So instead, we're going to just help you understand. And I think it's good for you to understand basic authentication so that you understand what's going on under the hood when Spring Security does a lot of the things that it just kind of does magically. So we're going to kind of, code it step by step and do a few things just to get that first part in place. Just being able to have somebody be able to register and log in, and then they can only see the pages you want them to, depending on whether they're logged in or logged out. So I recommend your capstone project as a great time to learn Spring Security. If you have if the application your team decides to build is a good fit for this, like you think having multiple user roles is a good thing, then it's a good, especially a good reason to learn it, because then you can use that authorization side of things to, have different roles. When I was a student, my project that we did, one of the guys on my team figured this out. He went and figured out Spring Security, and it ended up that in 8 weeks, we really did not have time to implement multiple roles, even though we had ideas about how that would work for our app. But, you're doing an MVP, you're doing the minimum viable product, right? So you only can do as much as you can to have a semblance of this is how the app would work. And then, maybe adding all those extra things would come at another iteration as you're working through, building up your application some more. But yeah, I recommend considering that to learn Spring Security as part of your capstone. Okay, so let's talk about sessions and cookies. So this is all about tracking user information in the browser and keeping track of whether your user is logged in or not is for sessions. So when you may have noticed, like when you're in a browser, you can navigate to a bunch of different pages in an app. And it's still keeping track of things like whether you have a bunch of things in your shopping cart, or what pages you've maybe put some information in on, and you come back to that page later and the information is still there. If you were started filling out a form, things like that. And part of that is because sessions exist, and information can be saved in the browser that matches with that session. The session is created on the back end when the user logs in or registers, and it knows. The session on the back end knows who the user is from the database, but only the session ID is actually passed to the browser, and it gets passed back and forth. And cookies are just single key value pairs that are stored in the browser. And one of those, the very first one that you'll have when you start a session, is that session ID to hold that. And then, again, you can have lots of cookies for tracking things. You can keep, lists of information and, all kinds of stuff. The session ID gets passed back and forth every time there's an HTTP request, and that maintains the session and makes sure that every time the user or your application is sending information, that it's sending it for the right user, so that it's not mixing up with somebody else's account that might be also have been used in the browser. And you can see how I did not mean to do that. For the love, you can see how. For instance, you use a browser in a public library, and you sign in and you sign out, and then someone comes along and they sign in and they sign out. You absolutely, if you're both using Gmail on the same browser on a public computer, you want to make sure that you're in your account and not theirs, and vice versa, right? So the sessions will do that for you. Okay, now I'm ready. Okay, so this whole flow, there really are multiple possible paths, and these are the most basic that I kind of have diagrammed here. So the first one is that there is no cookie existing in this browser for a session ID, and there can be multiple reasons for that. They've never registered before, they need to register, or the cookie was deleted, or maybe you're just on a different device than you were before. When that happens, the person visits the site and there's no cookie, no stored session ID. It's going to just route all the way to login and have them go through either the registration or login process. And then, when it gets to the authorization that you've put in place, either it's success and there's a session created and the ID is sent to the browser and a cookie is set with that session ID for the remainder of the session. And then you can go to any pages that were previously restricted, or there's failure and it's just going to go right back to that login page. So you can try again. Another path is that the cookie does exist because you've got an existing user. So the person goes to visit the page, they get here, and there is a cookie, it has a session ID. So we go down and touch base with the server and say, is this session valid? And either it is, they're still logged in from the last time and it's still good, and you can just, go knock yourself out, do what you want to do right away. Or maybe it's invalid because, it could be, it's expired just because maybe they time out after, a couple of weeks or something. I'm sure everyone has experienced this. Or, you logged out, logged in and logged out. So the cookie might have been there, but the ID is no longer any good. Okay, so the third one, if you are just on the login page, yeah, I covered this part already. Yeah, for when you are actually logging in, you give your username and password, you either succeed with that or you fail with that. And every time you come back and log back in, it goes through this process of creating a new session and, sending it to the browser and then setting that cookie and then, it'll pass it back and forth as long as you continue to make HTTP requests through the site. And then, when you're registering, the only other thing that's happening here is that you're also creating a user for the first time and storing that password hash for the first time. But otherwise, you kind of just keep cycling through this and that, authentication and with the assistance of having a session and having a cookie to store that session ID helps with that process to make it seamless. I remember way back in the day when sometimes people didn't handle this super well. And I don't think that there were frameworks that handled it as well as what we have today. I think that was part of the problem, but it was so frustrating to have to keep logging in over and over and over again because they weren't actually tracking the session. So I'm a big fan of this whole flow. Okay, so this concept of password hashing, and we are actually going to get to some coding in a minute, I promise, but we got to kind of talk about the concepts first. Password hashing is this idea of encrypting the password for storage. You do not ever want to store a real password in a database. So you can use a cryptographic, I really can't get that out apparently, cryptographic, there we go, hash function, or just hash function. Every time the user logs in, you'll encrypt that password that they supply and then check it against the hash that's in the database. And of course, when they first register, you're hashing it for the first time and saving it to the database. And if you check the hash against the hash, it should match. And the reason that they're going to be the same is because we're using the same exact hash function every single time. And the one that is recommended is bcrypt. And it's a dependency that's added in build.gradle. And with this, it's highly unlikely that anyone is ever going to try to reverse engineer the original password because it's complex enough. It has a lot of little things built in, including this concept called salting, to make it where it really, really would be difficult to work backwards from the hash to get to the password. And also, it's complex enough that it shouldn't be obsolete anytime soon. The more computing power that we have available to us because of better technology, the faster these kinds of things can be, deciphered. And so there are some hash functions that are obsolete now because our, technology just outpaced their ability to successfully and really safely keep things hashed securely. But this is a good one. So this is the one we're going to use. Okay, so now we're going to get to the part where we get to do some coding. When we set up a user, we set this up as an entity. This is absolutely, a class that we want persistent storage for, but we want to store the username and the hash of the password, not the password. So those are the two minimum fields that you would need for your user, other than an ID, which you can, inherit from abstract entity. And you need just one getter for username. You don't need any setters. We can add a static variable called encoder, and that uses that bcrypt hash function to create this object we can use. And then there's a number of functions that are really useful. So the first one would be, in the constructor where we normally just would say like, save password to password, we can receive the plain text password that we get from the user into the constructor, but then actually encrypt it before we set it into that PW hash field for that class. And that way it immediately only stores the hash. And then we need a method to actually check whether the hashes match. Anytime someone is trying to log in, and you don't want to use like to reuse the encoder.encode that you used the first time when you were setting it for the first time, and then use the Java string equality method equals. Those actually will not work for this, but encode.matches, it has its own function that basically does all those things together. It goes and looks up, it hashes the new password to see if it matches the old password, checks it, and then lets you know yes or no, true or false, this did or did not match. And then the only thing you really need for the repository is just a regular interface like any other repository, except you're also going to add one custom query method. And you know how we have all these CRUD repository methods we've been using, like save and find by ID, find all. You can actually create your own custom query methods using these rules that CRUD repository has. That as long as you do things a certain way and in a certain order and name it right, it'll automatically know what to do with it. So in this case, we can create find by username, pass in a username, and give it a way to go look up the user using their username instead of their user ID, which is really, really useful during the authentication process. So that's kind of the one thing that we'll actually do inside the body of that repository. Okay, so let's see, do I want to do anything else? Yeah, there's no need for a controller for user because we're going to end up setting up an authentication controller that's going to kind of tie together all of these things. So let's go over and start getting some of this stuff set up. Okay, so what we have here is the same art gallery project that you've seen before, except that I've added a few things to kind of get it prepared for us to do this. And first thing is, you can see in the fragments file here in the header, I've added some additional links that we'll be using for login and register and log out. And we're going to have a way to kind of, tell if the users are logged in or logged out, so we can show the right links to the right audience. But the user does not yet exist. So we're going to go create a model here. It's a new class. And this is going to be, an entity because it needs to be persistent, and it's going to extend abstract entity because we want to be able to have that ID. But we need, some fields, right? And there's only 2 fields we really need. We need, you could have more. You could have all kinds of things associated with user. You could have a user profile, those kinds of things. We're just going to stick with the simplest things, which are the username and the password. So I can say, private string username and private string, but I'm not going to use password. We're going to handle that separately. What we actually want to pass into the database is going to be the hash of the password, so that it's, decrypted, or I'm sorry, encrypted. So we just need a no arg constructor for Hibernate. And we also need the regular constructor. And honestly, I could just use the thing for this. So yeah, let's do that. Well, for both of these, and it's going to say, we're passing in the hash. We're actually not going to do that. We're going to pass in a password. And I'm going to put this here for now, but this isn't actually what we'll do. We're going to hash it first and then assign it to the field here. So let's add the getter. We only need one getter, and just for the username. Okay, so that should do it, except we also want to put not null on here, just to make it, impossible to create a user and put it in the database unless these are both there. If for some reason something wasn't quite set up elsewhere, that would prevent this from happening. And you don't need any messages on these because this is not going to be tied directly to the template. We're going to use the DTOs for that to actually do the data binding and then get the password. And then we'll be able to pass it in through here to set it with the hash. So that's it for that part. However, we still need to hash the password. So let's look at what we need for this. For one thing, we need an encoder object. So I'm going to come up here and create private, static, and final bcrypt password encoder right there. And we're going to have a new bcrypt password encoder. And we can just instantiate it just like that. And now we have this object we can work it with and use the methods that will help us protect this password. So the first thing to do here is to update this and say encoder.encode password. All right, so that makes sure that the hash that's sent into the database from the entity that is based on this model will have this hashed password. But we also want to add something that's going to serve us later, which is to have a instance method called isMatchingPassword. And this will return encoder.matches password and the hash. So we call this matches. That's going to take care of not only hashing the plain text password that came from the form, but it's also going to compare the two behind the scenes. And then this returns, true or false. And so we will need this later. We want to make sure that before this is actually goes through that we can catch if they, in fact, didn't use the right password. This is how we're going to do it. Okay, so let's see what's next. We are going to create a user repository. That's kind of the only other thing we need that's specifically user related until we start getting into the actual authentication stuff. So we'll come up here to data and I'm going to create an interface because repositories are interfaces. User repository. Okay, give it the repository annotation. I will extend the CRUD repository interface and make sure to give it the user class and integer class for the ID. And then this is where, unlike anything you've done before, we're actually going to add a method in here that is going to return the user object. And we're just going to call it find by username. And according to the rules of CRUD repository, we can do this, create a custom query method. And this will let us use the username to look up a user. Because when someone fills out the form online, they're not going to be putting in any sort of ID for themselves from a database. They're going to be putting in their username. So we need to have a way to look it up just based on what they give us. So that's what this is going to do for us. Okay, so that's it for the user. We'll come back over here and talk about DTOs. Data transfer objects. That's what a DTO is. And the idea is that it's going to just bundle data together so you can send and receive it kind of all in a bunch. And this can be like, multiple unrelated entities, kind of like in the coding events project that Chris Bay has been taking you guys through. In that case, he was binding together, this was in chapter 18, he was binding together tags and events. And because it was two different entities, but he wanted to be able to tie them together, he created this DTO that would do that. But in our case, what we're going to do for this particular example is to facilitate data binding for a form that they're not unrelated entities. It's just that we want a specific set of fields that we want to be able to bind to this form with. But we don't need it to be persistent. It's not going to be an entity. So that's what this DTO is going to do for us. So, we can grab the password out of the form and put it in this DTO and then do what we need to do in the controller and then pass that password into the user object to be saved in the database. Okay, so naming convention for DTOs, if you have like two classes that are connected, you can kind of do class 1, class 2 DTO. Chris for the coding events project had called it, event tag DTO, for example. In our case, we're going to be doing it for the login form and the registration form. So, this is a kind of a good way to name it. And you just notice anything, it's got a DTO on the end. It makes it really easy to tell what class you're talking about if you just stick that DTO on the end. Any private fields that you've got, you'll want validation since this is going to bind with a form. But you can just have an implicit default constructor. You don't actually have to define one. And then you want the getters and setters for the fields. And you don't add the entity annotation because again, we don't want this to be persistent. Okay, so let's actually go over and create those DTOs and then we'll come back and get started on the authentication portion. So over here in models, I'm going to create a package called DTO. And inside here, I will create the first one, which is just going to be login form DTO. And okay, so this is going to just have not null, not blank, and size, because we're going to set, let's do, I don't know, 30. We're going to set these to bind with the form. Let me just say username must be 3 to 30 characters long. That'll work. Oops, no semicolon. Okay, and then here we go. And so then this is going to be on a username. And then we're essentially going to do the same thing with the password. We can change the values a little bit. So we can say it's like a minimum of, maybe say minimum of 8. That's nice and strong. And so we'd say 8 to 30. And then maybe, because this is going to be on the form, we might want other messages as well. So we could say, message equals, username is required. And we could throw that on here. So password. Okay. So we have our 2 fields for the DTO. And so we just need, again, we don't need to define a constructor. We can just have it use the default no arg constructor that it will provide either way. And so now I'm going to create getters and setters for both of these. And that is it. So this will cover, having some sort of object that can be instantiated from this class that we can bind to the form with these 2 fields on the login form. So the registration form, we can do very similarly. But instead of having to reproduce the username and password, we're actually going to use inheritance. All right, so inside here, again, I could just copy all of this, but I'd rather just use inheritance because we can use exactly everything that's in there. And then we'll just add one more field. So I'm going to say extends login form DTO. All right. And then, so now we'll add our new field. And I actually think I can borrow this because I won't have to retype all of those annotations. But essentially, verify password should be the same. And it's arguable that you don't necessarily need this because we're also going to be checking to make sure they're the same, but I'm just going to put it all on there. That's fine. And then we just need the getter and setter for that. Okay, so we've got this. So to be clear, because we're extending this, this class is going to include both user and password from login form DTO and the new third field, verify password. And that'll be able to bind to the registration form, which is going to have all three of those fields. All right, so we're good to go. We're going to have something we can use in our controller. So let's talk about the authentication controller. We will create an authentication controller and use the controller annotation, of course. We'll declare a user repository instance because we're going to need to be able to use, work with the user. And then we're going to create this variable called user session key that basically just gives us a way to define the key we're going to use that's going to be set. And then we'll be able to use it multiple times. We'll be able to use it in this instance method, get user from session. Once a session has been created, we want to go look up the user object, and we'll be able to use that user session key there. It'll pass it in a session object of the HTTP session class. This is what allows us to create the session IDs, the cookies that are needed for passing back and forth. And then we will also define a method called set user in session that is what we call when they first register or they successfully log in, that starts a new session to make sure it's clear that they're logged in, and then gives them access to the pages that we have restricted. So let's go do this part, and then let's do that first part that we just talked about, and then we'll get to the handlers for the forms themselves. So I'm going to come up here to controllers, and I'm going to create a new controller as a class called Authentication controller. Okay. And I'm going to give it the controller annotation. I'm going to auto wire the user repository. And then I'm going to create these additional things we talked about. So we're going to declare a user session key, private static final, and string, user session key. And we're just going to give it the string value user. But that way we can, always consistently use it by using the variable everywhere we need it. Let's go ahead and do actually the set user in session. So I'm going to do private static void set user in session. And then we're going to use this session object that is of the HTTP session interface, and then also tap into our user object. We passing that in. So we're basically saying we've got a user, they're in a session, or no, we have a user, we've looked them up, and now we want to set them in the session. So we'll say session.set attribute, and the attribute we want to set is the key. Oops. There it is. And then the ID. Okay, so that basically says, take this key that we established up here, user, and set it as a key value pair with the ID of the user from the database. So this is our getter for the user class, right? So that's going to establish that so that there's a relationship between the session and the user ID that comes from the database, but that's always kept, here on the server. But that also creates a whole bunch of other things. I mean, it's creating a session ID and the cookies and all of that will be able to communicate with the browser. Now let's do the last one, which is to create the thing that goes and gets a user from a session, just to see if there still is a user logged in, and if the session is available. Okay, so we're going to need a user ID. And we're going to cast it to an integer because that's what we're going to need. And in this case, we're going and looking up that user session key that we had set originally, or whatever user session key is currently in the browser in any case. Okay, and the first thing we can do is say, if that user ID comes back as null, because we went into the session to look for it, and but that user ID doesn't actually mean anything, then oops, excuse me. There we go. Then we're just going to return null and say, yep, no user, sorry. The second thing to do is to, and we're gonna need an optional for this, to actually go, oops, I need to get the optional class. There we go. We're gonna actually look for this user object, but I'm gonna call this user optional because it's clearer that we're still working with the container that the user would be in. We'll go to the repository, find by ID, give it that user ID. So if there was a user session key and it has the ID saved, then we're going to use that to find the user in the database. And if that user is, user optional, comes back empty, then we're also going to return null, because again, there's no valid user for that. But if those two things are not true, then we want to just go ahead and return user.get, which of course, user optional. There we go. Is unboxing the actual user class object from the optional, and that's it. So that's kind of the steps to go through to make sure we get a real user from the database that's associated with the current session. All right, and I think IntelliJ just quit on me. Yeah, it did. Okay. Oh, nothing if not an adventure. Okay, I've got it, but it's going to take a second to index everything. That's okay. We are ready to go over here and talk about this stuff. So in the registration and login setup process, we are going to need not only to have those kind of custom helper methods we just wrote, but also, of course, the handlers for the pages. And you haven't actually seen the templates. I went ahead and put them in here ahead of time because I needed, let me just double check that my controller, oh, it lost all the stuff that I just did. Fantastic. Okay, that's all right. Give me just a second. All right, I'm just gonna copy this back in from a solution I've got. Right. So let me show you the templates. All right, so these templates we have are right here in the templates folder. They're actually directly underneath it. So the only thing I had here previously was fragments and index, but I've also added login and register. So we can take a look at these. They're just regular timely forms, fields. I've set them up to have the username and password labels, and then they are binding to the login form DTO.username, because this is, of course, exactly how we set up our DTO classes, to have those two fields, and we can bind to both TH field and then the error messages, just as we have in the past and other things. So that's there. And then register looks similar, except of course it also has the verify password. But we don't have any handlers for these forms. So I can't actually pull them up in the browser yet, because there's no get handler and there's no, and then of course, even if we had that, we couldn't submit them because there's no post handler. So let's come back over to our authentication controller and get those set in. Okay, so the basic plan here is that we're going to use these get handlers to load the pages for both login and register. And in both cases, we want to use our model.attribute method to send a new instance of that DTO class, whichever one it is, so that it can do the model binding. And so that the template is already aware of the fields that are there that will bind with the input fields. So we do that with the TH field and TH errors, as you saw. And then we will, be able to put that all together. And then for the post handlers, it's a little more involved. And there's a few things you can do for both to start off. Of course, you always, check for errors first, right? So we'll just send it back to the form if there's any kind of errors from the initial validation. But then we will also go and see, is there an existing user that has that username? That's where we're going to use that custom query method we wrote in the user repository, get by username. And then we can use this method of the errors class called reject value to kind of write a custom error message on the fly and specify which field it goes to, and say, if a certain thing happens, go send this error message to this field, and it'll appear in the same place as any of our other error messages would. Oops, I went too far. So for registration, at that point, after we've done this, we would also send an error message back if the user already exists. We'll send an error message if password and verified password don't match, which we can do. Those are both just strings at that point, so we can just do an equals to compare those. And then otherwise, we're going to create that new user object, save the user to the database, and then set the user in session with our method we wrote in the authentication controller up at the top. For login, on the other hand, we're more interested in what happens if the user doesn't exist or if the password was wrong. So we can send an error message back for that. And then again, otherwise we'll set them in a session and create a new session. So those parts are more similar there at the end. Okay, so let's go code all of that because it's actually going to be quite a lot. All right, so we're going to, we are in our authentication controller, just to be clear. We have our user repository, we've got our user session key, our set user in session helper method, our get user from session method. Now we're going to set up our handlers. Okay, here we go. Okay, so we're going to use get mapping, of course. And this is going to go to the register. We'll do that one first. Display registration form, model. Looks like I don't have model in here yet. There we go. And then we'll just use that to set that attribute. And this is where we just send new registration form DTO to create a new instance and pass it in. Now you may notice there's no first parameter here. I could write registration form DTO with a comma like we usually do, but there's actually a shorthand. It will create that for me if I just pass in this new instance. So that's a little bit of a shortcut for you. And then we can return register to send it to the register template and display this page and have this structure so it knows how to bind to the input fields. Post mapping. We want to register just as before, same path. And this one's going to be process registration form. And we will need to first have our model binding, so model attribute, and also make sure to validate to the annotations that are in the class registration form. Oops, form DTO. There we go. Okay. And we need errors. That always goes right after whatever the object is that you're binding to. And then after this, we can say model, And we can also add this HTTP servlet request to be able to have access to the full request that is coming in. There we go. All right. Now that just got really long, so I'm going to do like this to get them, you know, all lined up there so you can kind of see each one. Okay. So now we are inside the body of this method. There's basically 4 things we want to do. Send user back if errors are found. Let me space this out a little bit and let me spell user correctly. So that would be, you know, if errors has errors, just like we do normally. And then we would just say return register. Just send them right back to that form. Well, first we have to look, okay, we're going to look up the user. And then we can make use of this username they provided in the form. And this is going to be, you know, I'm going to call it existing user because that's essentially what we're checking for. That's why you would do this in a registration form. And here we're going to use that find by username we created, and we'll pass in the DTO get username. So to be clear, what's happening here is we are going to our database and saying, I've got a username from the form that this person is using to try to register. Go look it up and see, see if it's actually exists. Do we have a username anywhere in our database that belongs to this? And then we'll come back, and if so, it gets stored in this, and if not, it'll be null. So that's how where we can kind of say, you know, if it's already exists and we have something, then we need to send them, you know, send the user back if username already exists. So in this case, we'd want that logic to be, you know, if the existing user is not null, it means that they already exist. So this is where we can create this custom error method by saying errors.rejectValue. The first thing we have to give it is the field name, and this is, of course, the username field. The second thing is a code, and if we were storing this like in some file out, you know, elsewhere, then this would bring that text in, but we're not, but it still has to be there for this to work. So I'm making it up. But what we really want is the message. So we're just going to provide a default message right here. The user with that username already exists. Okay, so we'll do that, and then of course return them back to the form. All right, so that was the next thing. The third thing is what happens if the passwords don't match? Send user back if passwords don't match. So this is just their, you know, remember they're registering, they're giving us a password, and they're giving us a second one to verify it. So we're just going to say, okay, let's get the password from the form, from this DTO object that was passed in with the binding, and we'll do the same thing for verify password. Yep. Okay. And then we can just check. If not password equals verify password. So if they do not match, if they're not the same, then we're going to do another one of these. Actually, I'm going to just copy this. Oops. And bring it down here. Okay. So this is going to be for the password field, and we'll call it password.mismatch, and just say, you know, passwords do not match. And maybe actually, instead of password, maybe I want that on verify password. So it's like under the very last one. That'll work. And then again, return them to the form. All right, so 3 different cases in which there could be errors of one kind or another. And these 2 are ones we're kind of, creating on the fly and sending back. But all of them have user feedback, so they know exactly what's going on if something is wrong. So then this very last thing is to have an actual final return if none of those things are true. So we'd say, otherwise, save the user object in database, start a new session, and redirect to home page. I actually think that I'm going to redirect to the artworks page for this because that's actually where I want them to end up once they've logged in. Okay, so we'll say, user, new user equals new user, and then we pass in the username from the form. And then remember our user class is set up to receive the password that they gave us. So we'll do, dot get password. And then inside the user class, it will hash it as it's saving it to PW hash. So we just give it the password and then it does the rest. So now we have a user object called new user that has a username and a hashed password in it. And this is where we can now say, okay, go put that in the database. So we'll use user repository dot save and just give it the new user. But we're not done because we still have to set a session. So we'll say request get session. So we're saying go find the session that's in this request already. And then the second parameter is to give it that user object. Okay. And the last thing is to return, and I'm going to redirect specifically to artworks so that it will go to that artworks index page. All right. So this is good. We have a way to register and a way to display the page, and then also a way to process the form. I'm going to say, let's go ahead and try this out. Okay, so there's an issue in the user repository with something. So we're gonna take a look at this, and yeah. So there's, I named this wrong, and this is why there are rules to this CRUD repository naming thing. Username does not have a capital N in it, therefore this needs to not have a capital N in it. Let's try this again. Now we have another problem. Oh, because I'm using it and it went ahead and used the one I already had. Yep. Okay. So let's try it again. Cool. Okay. So now we can come over here, go to localhost 8080. And I don't have a link ready for this yet. So I'm going to just say register. We get our form. And in this, we can try, I don't know, let's say, I think I already have a Kamalakan in this one. Let's do Clark Kent. Why not? A little BC. All right. And it's registered, and now it's sent me to the artworks page. Now, right now, I already could have gone anywhere I wanted, really, because nothing has been like declared off limits. So we'll get to that in a minute, but at least we know we have a way to register somebody. So let's get the login user in place. Login handlers is the words I'm looking for. Yeah. Okay, so this one, it gets set up the same way as the registration page for just, displaying the page. This is pretty much the same. public string display login form. We just need the model so we can pass in an instance of the login form DTO class. Oh, heavens. Okay. Login form DTO. There we go. I probably got imports now that I don't need because of all these mistakes I've been making. Come up here. Yeah, let's clean this up. Okay. We're down at the bottom. Okay. So yeah, and then of course return login, because we want it to go to that template. Okay. Here is the other side of the coin, which is submitting the login form. And we'll just say process login form. And here I'm going to actually start with the model attributes. Do this the same way, you know, at valid login form DTO, login form DTO. Okay. Errors, HTTP servlet request, and model. Clean this up a little bit. Okay. First thing is, you know, send user back to form if there are errors. Okay. And I mean, this part is the same. In fact, so is the lookup. So I'm going to copy these two, actually. We'll just do this. But then I'll just change this from registration form to login form DTO. And that takes care of the first part. You know, we're logging in, we're going to go and try to find this user. And then we will, in this case, look and see, maybe they don't exist. We also, however, are going to want the password. I'm going to go ahead and just do that now here too. So get the password user supplied in the form. So this is what they just put into the form when they submitted this. String password equals login form DTO dot get password. Okay, so now we can use both of these. The reason I wanted to go ahead and do both the user and the password at the same time is because there's this idea called security through obscurity, that it's become more common to not have two separate error messages for something like this, because someone might try to like just kind of try things logging in and see if they get the right username or see if they get the right password. And it's better if you don't tell them which one was the problem. So we're going to actually do these at the same time and say if the user equals null, or sorry, not user, existing user. Or then user, and this is where we're going to call that matching password thing that actually matches the hashes. We give it the plain string that they supplied us with, and it sends it into the user class and checks to see if it matches their hash. So if either of those things are true, then we want to reject it and provide a custom message. And in this case, I'm going to put it on the password field just so it's on the bottom. You can kind of put it wherever you want, but that's where I'm going to put it. And then I'm going to just call it, you know, login invalid. That part doesn't matter, except for it does have to be a string. So let's do that. Okay. And then this is the message. And I'm just going to say something really generic. Credentials invalid. Please try again with the correct username, password combination. All right. So let me actually clean this up a little bit. I'm going to do for this like I've done for the others and just kind of get them on separate lines. So it's a little easier to see. Yeah. So we're rejecting it and we're going to send this message to the password field. And then we would return them to the form. Okay. So that takes care of both of those cases. Maybe the username doesn't exist. Maybe the password was wrong for a perfectly good username. Either way, they'll get that message and know that they need to, get the right combination. Otherwise, we create a new session for the user and take them to the artworks page. Okay. So set user in session. Again, we use that HTTP servlet request object request and call get session so we can actually get the current session. And then we pass in existing user. Okay. And then we can just return redirect artworks. Okay. So, covering all of our bases here as much as we can. There are other types of validation we probably could do, but we're going to keep this relatively simple. So we now have that. I'm going to go ahead before we do anything else and add the logout. I'm not sure if I covered that in the slide. Yeah, logging out. Let's do this real fast, and then we'll test it. Put a link on the nav bar to route to logout so we have a way to do it because it's not actually a page, but it's just a route. And then we will create the get handler so that it knows where to go once it's done. And then we're going to want to have access to that request again so that we can invalidate the session. And then we can just redirect to the login page or maybe to the home page. It really kind of depends on what you're going for. But that is all there is to it. This will be very easy. So we're going to create get mapping. For when that link is clicked, which we do need to go activate that in a second. And I'm going to get that servlet request. And so the first thing is to use the request, get the session, and invalidate it. So now that session will no longer be valid if they try to do anything that would be restricted, which of course we haven't restricted anything yet, but we will. And let's see, where do I want to send them? I'll send them back to login. That's fine. I mean, I guess I could, if I wanted to, just send them back to home. Yeah, let's do login. Okay, we'll do that for now. And I did say that before I restarted this, I was going to go and make these active. Now, you're going to see something here where it says, a TH unless logged in and a TH if logged in. So they only see login and register if they're not logged in. And then they only see artists, artworks, and styles and log out if they are logged in. And you're probably thinking, where is this coming from, right? Well, something I did ahead of time because it took too much time, I didn't want to do it live, is I went into my other forms. I'll pull up one, for example, the ad form. Actually, I mean, I could show you, yeah, okay, there's two things. It's not the form, it's the controller. I'll show you the gallery controller. Okay. I redid this to where, first of all, my homepage actually just redirects to welcome. So then the welcome page is the one that actually sends to the index template. And I've gone here and actually used model.attribute to pass in this logged in thing. And I am hooking into the session and saying, see if there's a user. And as long as it's not null, we're going to say this is true. Otherwise, it's false. And that way, each of the templates knows, whether to which side of the menu to display. And I went through and I did this for all of them. Well, for anything that has get mapping, obviously, because it's only on the ones where we're displaying the page where it matters. So I've done it here, I've done it here, and on each one of those, I just added this session to the parameters. And so now when we come back here, and okay, now I need to restart it though. Let me restart it. And I'll refresh. And it does say that we are still logged in, still in session. If I say log out, the session has been invalidated, and now we see different links. We see login and register. So I'm already on the login page. Let's try, I'll try my Kamala Khan identity. And let's see. And now we're back and we have the alternate menu again, including log out. So that's one way that you can control it. Now, I only had to do all of that, go to this much trouble, because I think I figured out why. It's because my version of Java and my combination of things that I was using, based on what start.spring.io provided for me when I got the project created from that website, it gives me a different library here called Jakarta. That's where all of my stuff is coming from. Whereas in the coding events and tech jobs projects that Launch Code prepared several years ago, those all use JavaX. And I think that there's some differences between some of these interfaces and classes that it makes it where I can no longer directly access the session from the template with this the way that I could and some of the other things. So that's why I had to go through and actually, add it myself to pass something in where I can access the session here and then give it this variable to use in the template. And maybe it is possible to do it with the Jakarta thing, but I did a lot of research on it and couldn't figure out how. So here we are. Okay, so right now, even if I'm logged out, I can still go to Artworks and still see everything because nothing has been restricted. There is no filtering in place. So we want to talk about this idea of filtering requests, restricting pages from logged out users. This is the idea. So we can intercept a request before the handler even executes. So the user makes the request, and normally we would say, okay, it's going to go to the route. It's going to find that get handler and it's going to execute it. We're going to say, nope, we're going to stop and wait and see if it's supposed to be, filtered or not. So we're going to create this class at the very top level of our application called Authentication Filter, and we will write a little code in there that's going to handle all of this. I did find that in my more recent version of Java, the handler interceptor adapter class is deprecated. So what they have you do instead, they're now just saying use the interface handler interceptor instead. This class was implementing this, and now they've done away with the class and just said use this and it will create everything you need. And then we're going to actually add an auto-wired instance of this filter to the controller so we can use it. And then we are going to override this pre-handle method that is the thing that intercepts the request before the handler executes. And we will have a signature that matches. I had originally written here that we are including a response and handler, even though we don't need them. Actually, we do use response for part of it. Handler is the only one we don't need, but the point is the signature has to match. So we need the request, the response, and the handler in the signature. We'll need a session variable, a user variable, and then we can, say if the user is not null, they must be logged in. So we're going to return true. And if the user is null, it means they're not logged in. So we're going to just redirect them to log in and return false. So this means that every time a user tries to go to one of our page, this thing is going to run, this pre-handle method will run, and it's going to check every single time. Do we have a session? Is the session valid? Is the user valid? And that will decide if we actually, display that page or if we send them to login. Okay, so let's do this part first, and then there's going to be one last thing. There's the whitelisting. Let's talk about the whitelisting in a second. We'll do this in two parts. Okay, so the first thing I said we needed to create this at the top level. That's up here at Art Gallery. So I'm going to create a class. I'm going to call it Authentication Filter. All right. we are going to say extends, and we're going to extend this handler interceptor. Oh, that's right. It needs to implement it because it is. There we go. Because again, that's the interface and not the class. Okay. First thing is to auto-wire our user repository. And then we also are going to auto-wire the authentication controller. Okay. So I said I was going to skip the whitelisting stuff right away. So let's go ahead and just do pre-handle for now. And again, this is overriding because pre-handle already exists. So we need to actually override it. But it returns a Boolean, true or false. Should I go to the handler or not? There's the question that's being asked there. So we have our request. Oops. And then the response. And then the handler, which we don't need. We're also going to just add this, throws IO exception. It's a particular type of exception, which hopefully will not be necessary. Okay, so that's the whitelisting stuff. Okay, so eventually we're going to have something a little bit up here about handling the whitelisting to determine which pages are which. But first, let's go ahead and just get the basics in place. So we're going to grab a session out of the request. All right, so now we have a session. We're going to get my user class in here. There we go. And we're going to go to the authentication controller and say get user from session, and then give it the session. And now we'll say, let's check and see if the user is logged in. So that would be if the user is not null. As long as the user is not null, when we get it out of the session, then we're going to return true. That means there is an active session and the user is good. Otherwise, the user's not logged in. And in that case, we want to actually redirect them. So we'll do response.send redirect. That's how we do this from here. And say login. And then return false. Okay. So again, the whole point of this is to intercept the request before it even gets to the handler and decide whether it should allow it to go to the handler or whether we should just send them to the login page, because they're not allowed to go to that page. So the next thing to talk about is whitelisting. I'm going to come back over here to our slides. If we want to define which pages are okay to be unrestricted, then we can declare this list of strings called whitelist. And we'll just, create a little list quickly using an array and pass it each one of the routes we want to make publicly available. So that would be like, log in, log out. Maybe you have an about page that's, public or whatever. There's different things. Register, obviously. But if any of your routes have subroutes, you don't need to list those because they're going to be included. It's only going to check kind of the root of the path. But yeah, at minimum, you need to whitelist, login, and register. So we'll create this little method to just go and check that list. Is the root in the list? If so, consider it whitelisted. And then in pre-handle, before we actually go get the session, we can just return true if that path is whitelisted. We don't need to go to the trouble of checking any further because we're not concerned with the user at that point because we're letting anybody view the page. Okay, so let's do this part. And let's start up here. All right, so I'm gonna just declare a whitelist. Say private static final. This is something that would only ever be altered here in the code. just hard coded with the way this is done. And I really would like this to be lowercase. Okay, whitelist is one word. Okay, and this is going to be arrays.asList. So we can just declare it in line here and initialize it to this. So I'm going to say, for my purposes, I just want login, register, log out. Actually, log out is something you do need to always include. I should have put that on the slide. And then also, if you want your styles to be available, you also need to do /CSS, because you might have stuff. And actually, for that matter, I have an image on the home page that I want to include. So I'm also going to do images. So basically, it's like any sort of routes, major routes, or any of the static resources that you want to include need to be listed here. And then in here, oh, nope. First, we have to write is whitelisted. Private static Boolean is whitelisted. And again, let's do lowercase on that. That gets me in trouble. And now we'll just loop through, and we're going to call it path route. Each of these can be considered a route because there could be additional things after them in some cases. Maybe you have, like a whole directory of things that you'd want to whitelist, not just the login and log out and stuff. And then we're going to check this against whitelist. So we're going to loop through each one of the strings in there. And then we'll just say if the entire path that was just passed into, up here, starts with path route. So that's just a string method that just says, if this is the first characters in this, longer path, then return true. Because anything after this is going to be allowable. Otherwise, you want to return false. Now, there's a problem here for my app because I want the home page to be included, but I can't just put this here because otherwise that allows everything. So what I'm going to do instead is handle it in the logic here. I'm going to say if path equals, it's a string comparison, so we're going to use equals slash, or if the path starts with path route. So I'm going to just kind of, before we even check the whitelist, I'm going to say, let me fix that. There we go. I'm going to say, if it's the home page, then go ahead and allow it. But that reminds me, my home page actually reroutes to welcome. So I'm going to put welcome in here too. I need to put that slash in there. Yep. Okay. I think we're good. So this is our logic that says, is it whitelisted or is it not? So here is where we can actually come in and have this little stopgap and just say, don't require sign in for whitelisted pages. Okay. So if is whitelisted, and then we'll pass in. So this is where we get the path from. We go into the request and we say get request URI, which means just the part of the URI is the part of the URL that comes after the host import. Oh, yes, it's a method. There we go. So if we get that URI, we pass it into here, it looks at the very front of it and says, is one of these things included? Then it will return true. Okay, and then if no, just return true. That's it. And that means, this entire pre-handle thing will go ahead and preemptively return true, and we won't even get into the session stuff because it's the general public. We're going to allow the page to go through. All right, so I can do this now, but it won't matter because we don't have it registered yet. So let's go register it. At the top level of our code, just like we did for the authentication filter file, we're going to add this file web application config and implement web MVC configurer. The configuration annotation will let Spring know that this is a configuration class. Most of the time configurations are not put in classes, but in this case, we are going to do it this way. And we can add an authentication filter method to return an instance of the authentication filter class. And then we will have a way to pass that in to the add interceptors method, which we will override, and then use this add interceptor method of the registry to register our filter. That way, the application is aware of it and it will actually put it in place and start restricting the pages. So let's do this new file. I come up here at Art Gallery, all above everything else. And I'm going to say new Java class and call it web application config. Okay. And this we said needed to implement the web MVC configurer. There we go. All right. So we're going to use this bean annotation. It basically just says, make this a Spring managed class. Make it clear that this is something that Spring is going to recognize as something it manages. All right. So we're naming this method the same thing as the class, but all it really does is say it gives us a chance to create an instance of this class and return that. And then we're going to override add interceptors. And, it needs to take interceptor registry, pass that in. And then it has the same signature now. And then we just simply add the interceptor authentication filter and call it from this method we just wrote right here, and it will pass that object in and register it. Okay, I'm going to stop this. I'm going to restart it all, and we're going to go test it out. All right. So let's go, and I'm just going to go back to localhost 8080. All right, so I have my welcome page, but you'll notice that it only gives me the options of logging in and registering. So let's say I go to login, and Kamala Khan, and I go in, and now I have access to a new menu here, and I have access to all of the functions of being able to add and delete artworks and all those types of things. But I can also log out. Now, if I try to go back now and get to artworks manually, just by pulling it up in the browser bar here, it's going to, it was not supposed to do that. Logout was supposed to invalidate the session. Interesting. Okay. It did log us out. Then why are we able to see this? Okay, oh, well, this is not going to be what fixes it, but I am realizing that this is wrong. I actually don't want to put this in the loop, right? There's no reason to loop through just to check if it's the home page. So I'm actually going to have a separate if here that just checks if it's the home page first, and then says return true if it is. And then we don't even have to loop through the whitelist because that's its own thing. Okay, but that does not fix our other issue. Everything here looks correct. It's got to be either the filter or the config. Oh, I forgot to put the annotation on here. So this is important. Configuration, there we go. Again, Spring doesn't recognize this as a configuration file unless you tell it it is. So it was not actually registering our filter, which is why we were able to see anything. So I'm going to restart this now, and it should register it now. Okay, so now if I try to go here, yes, it takes me to the login. So I can, demonstrate this again. Lowercase Kamala. All right, so I'm in, and I can see, all kinds of things here. But then if I decide I want to log out, it takes me to the login page. And if I go up here and I try to get back to one of those pages that I was just in, it just reroutes me right back to login. That's how it's supposed to work. But if I go home, because I specifically allowed that before I checked the whitelist, it does, reroute and take me to the welcome page, and I'm right where I want to be. But I still have my login and register links up here. Okay, great. So that is how you can set up authentication on in a basic way. I know it seemed not very basic, it's quite a lot, but it's still way more simple than using Spring Security. So this works. So you're going to basically go to this Tech Jobs starter code that's special just for the studio. Very much pared down. It has a lot less classes than you're using in your graded assignment. And you're going to do the exact same process that we just did. And it is also the exact same process that's in your coding events example. Dang it. And then you can, this bonus mission would be using session.isEmpty in your template to conditionally display certain page links in the nav bar. So you can try that out, see if you can figure it out, but I'll have it in the solution as well. And that is it. You guys have, oh, that's funny. That slide, now I remember deleting that, so I don't know what happened there, but the slide got totally screwed up. All right, so one more class with me, guys, class 20 on talking about REST, and then you've got your catch-up class, and then you'll be moving on to unit 3. So thanks for sticking with me. You guys head off to studio and have fun working through this. It seems really, really overwhelming, especially when I'm talking at you like at 1,000,000 miles an hour because we're running out of time. But once you've done it a couple times, it actually kind of all starts to make sense. So you guys should be good.
Hey, Carrie, real quick. Zach and Dakota's group, if you guys are still in here, go ahead and check your small group. You guys are coming on over and join a small group with Sean and Kelly. Thank you, Carrie.
Yeah, thank you. All right, you guys head off and I'll see ya.
Thanks, Carrie.
Thanks, Katie.
Thank you.